Touchdown, Miami!
Jackson thrown to the end zone. What a night, Bo Sparks. Make it 4.
Shakes through a couple of tacklers, still on his feet. Hawkins to the end zone. Unbelievable.
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. Welcome in, everyone, to a special edition of Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. I am, as always, your host, Jared Palmgren, and we are back with our fifth edition of the annual Way Too Early CFF Mock Draft Special, which has become the unofficial kickoff to every new CFF season. We've got almost all of your favorite CFF faces here to provide you with a great crash course that'll help you get started for your research into the 2026 college fantasy season. Much about the special has remained the same from years prior, but in case you are new or have forgotten the rules, I will be going and running down everything you need to know before we get started. In this special, we are going to have 14 different college fantasy analysts in 12 different draft spots, and each one of them is going to talk about their teams as well as their experiences and lessons from this draft. Before each pick, I'll briefly introduce each expert, give a quick rundown of the teams that they drafted, and then they'll take their turn answering a series of questions that I have laid out for them, as well as bring their own analyses to the table as to where things stand headed into the 2026 college fantasy season. I really do want to thank each and every one of these experts, and I'll make sure to thank them individually once they finish their segment. This draft and special would not be possible at all without them dedicating their time and their effort to providing you guys the best analyses. Also, this special is not going to be the only analysis we provide on this draft. If you want to see the full draft board, make sure you head over to my Twitter at CFF_Jared. You'll find the entire full draft board posted there. In addition, there's going to be a second Chasing the Natty episode, which will be released next week, where we will be analyzing and breaking down the draft round by round. So please make sure you check that out as well. And if you want to make sure you don't miss that, make sure you follow the show's Twitter account at Chasing the Natty. Every time a new episode is posted, it will be posted there as well. Finally, if this is your first time coming to Chasing the Natty channel, I hope you guys stick around, and you make sure you can do that by clicking that subscribe button and making sure that notification bell is turned on. In addition, please leave comments down below regarding anything with this draft. Finally, if you're listening to this on the podcast version of the special, please make sure you're following us on whatever platform you're listening to and that you leave those beautiful, wonderful 5-star reviews. In addition, if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, I also recommend checking out the video version on YouTube, where each expert will have the team they drafted right next to them as they speak, and you'll also see round by round the draft at the bottom of the screen. Now, before we begin, let me go over the format of this draft as well as the roster requirements, just so that everybody is on the same page. This draft was made up of 12 teams and was conducted in a snake order. The order in which the teams drafted was determined by random chance ahead of the draft. The draft contained only 9 rounds, as it's very early in the offseason, and most people's rankings haven't really been finalized enough for us to really go much deeper than that. The roster was also made up of 9 starting spots. Each team by the end will contain at least 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and then 1 flex position player of their choosing. There are no bench players in this draft. While these roster requirements may cause the second half of the draft to not exactly give you what we'll see ADP do as the offseason goes along, it does provide each of you the opportunity to see the top names at each of the positions, which can definitely serve as a starting point for each of your own rankings. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Up first with the first official pick of the 2026 CFF season, we have Campus of Canton's own and host of the Defending the Natty CFF Dynasty podcast, Nate Marchese. You can find Nate on Twitter at CFF Nate, as well as his incredible writing over at campus2canton.com. On his team, Nate has drafted Malachi Toney, wide receiver out of Miami of Florida, wide receiver Parker Kingston out of BYU, Will Henderson, the running back out of UTSA, Jordan Dwyer, the wide receiver out of TCU, Nick Marsh, the wide receiver out of Indiana, Wayshawn Parker, the running back out of Utah, quarterback Damon Williams out of Washington, and quarterback Mario Taylor out of Mississippi State, and finally tight end Dorian Thomas out of Cal. With all that being said, let's start us off strong, Nate.
Welcome everyone to Jared's way too early CFF 2026 mock draft. My name is Nate Marchese. Very happy that Jared was able to squeeze me into this mock draft and draft with these degenerates that are selecting all these players that literally won't play a snap for 8 months. But it was a ton of fun. Lo and behold, I actually was able to get the 101 draft spot, which was pretty weird for me. I literally did not have a single draft pick in the first half of the first round all of last year through my dynasty and my best ball draft. So it's been a long time since I got to pick this early, but it was fun because I got my boy Malachi Toney there at the 101. I'm sure a lot of people are going to address this as we discuss the draft about how real it felt wide receiver scarcity was for a lot of people. I mean, we're talking Amari Thomas went at the 104, which kind of blew my mind. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I mean, Froton's right. We were all a little worried about how quickly the top end wide receivers were going to go. I think what I learned through this draft is that wide receivers are actually deeper. As the draft went on, I was like, oh man, I'm still getting some solid players here, like some really high upside guys. I mean, Jordan Dwyer, I got in the fourth round, very end of the fourth round, and Nick Marsh as well too. And I mean, I think those are guys that are going to be, the top receivers in a Sonny Dykes offense and that Indiana offense that's scoring a ton of points right now. So as it turns out, I mean, I think receiver was maybe a little bit deeper than what I thought. But I certainly made some picks early on thinking that those spots would go fast, and they did. I think more than anything, it's just the top end of that wide receiver group. The guys that we can trust, that have a really, really high floor, are the ones that are going quick, and then there's a pretty big drop after that as far as how safe you feel about some of these picks. So as far as like who was my favorite pick? Man, I picked a lot of my guys. I'll be totally honest. The fact that anytime I get a chance to take Malachi Toney, I'm going to do it. I was singing his praises before the season even started last year, and you know what? He made me look pretty smart for once, so that was nice. So I love being able to take Malachi Toney at the 101. I like taking Will Henderson right there at the 301. I needed a running back at that point because I had taken Parker Kingston at the other side of that elbow in the second round. Brandon High returns from his short stay at Cal where he did nothing, and he was fairly productive for UTSA. But man, I think they know what they got in Will Henderson, and he was dynamic for them towards the end of the season last year. So I'm hoping that things kind of continue how he left off in 2025, and he's able to put together a really, really strong 2026. I loved being able to, with as condensed as this draft was, so many QB options, and it's only 9 rounds. So I felt like I could really kind of punt, so to speak, and wait till the final 3 rounds before I started taking my quarterbacks. And even though I've written about how DeMond's had a really kind of rocky offseason already, being able to get him where I did in round 7, after a number of quarterbacks had already gone off the board. I think he was like QB 11 or 12 maybe at that point. And then in round 8, I went with my boy Mario Taylor from Mississippi State. I mean, I trust the Jeff Lebby system when it comes to quarterback production. I think he's in line for a really big season. I debated between him or Bryce Underwood right in that spot, and so I went ahead and took Mario. So those are some of the picks that I feel pretty good about. As far as the ones I don't feel great about, I mean, I like Parker Kingston. I think he's got a chance to be a top 10 wide receiver this year. I think his floor is really high. He's, same team, same coach, same offensive coordinator, same quarterback. He's one of only a handful of players in the entire country where that is his situation. So I think the floor is really high. I just think taking him, doubling up on receiver with my first 2 picks, I didn't realize that guys like Jordan Dwyer and Nick Marsh would still be around in my next turn there. So I probably should have waited and taken a running back there to go along with Will Henderson. I like Wayshawn Parker, but having him as my having him as my RB2 isn't the best feeling. Obviously, if this were a real draft, I could flood in some more running back selections to solidify that position. But in this draft, I mean, I got Will Henderson and Wayshawn Parker as my only running back, so don't love that. Not because I don't like Parker. I just think if I had taken somebody else other than Parker Kingston, I would have felt better about my running back situation overall. So that's probably something that I would do differently in that sense. I'll be honest. I punted on tight end as well too. It's January. I'm sorry, but I haven't done a ton of research on the tight end position yet, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to save that for my last pick. I like the offense that Cal's putting together with JKS and the coordinator that Lupoy's brought over there. Thomas, even though he's transferring up, he was pretty effective at the pass game with New Mexico. I think maybe had I done that again, maybe I would have taken Juice Farine or Chudzinski, but you know what? I'll save those picks, I guess, for real drafts later this year. There were definitely some guys that surprised me that didn't go. Most of them are quarterback, again, because it's condensed, and there's a lot of good quarterbacks that get left off the board whenever you can only take 2 quarterbacks for your entire roster. I mean, guys, like I said, I really like Bryce Underwood, Mike Hawkins, Helms over at Army. I mentioned JKS. Those are some really solid quarterbacks that I think could all finish in the top 24 and did not go in this draft. Running back Joe Jackson over at K-State. They've added in some transfers, so I'm not 100% sure he's going to be able to continue what he did to finish the season. But man, I mean, you talk about finishing strong. Those last 2 or 3 games, boy, he was an absolute stud there towards the end. Some players that I would expect to kind of rise or fall. I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on how some of the camp battles go. I mean, we all want to know what's going to happen with the Arizona State running back room. We were in the same position last year, and of course, Raleek Brown, who hardly anybody was drafting, ends up being the guy. But again, we're gonna watch that one closely, see what happens. I think Avery Johnson's going to go higher than he did in this draft. He was right around QB 14 or 15. I could see him certainly being higher. As far as guys that could fall, I think all of the LSU wide receivers are going to go just kind of slowly work their way down the board as camp reports come out. Chase Brown is somebody that I think probably won't get drafted as high later on. Similar to the Texas Tech running back room, I mean, there's a lot of bodies now in there. Cameron Dickey went really early in this draft. Don't hate it. I mean, he was an absolute stud last year, had, close to like right around 1,300 yards and like 18 touchdowns or something crazy. But, I mean, as people catch wind of kind of how Joyner's health is, it's potential for him to fall, something like that. Any room where there's multiple bodies that could kind of pull all the ships down there. So, yeah, overall, man, it was a lot of fun doing this draft. Hope I get to do it again, and we'll see if some of these players actually come through and end up being really solid players come this fall. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you very much, Nate. Up next is the godfather of CFF and the Gridiron Scholar himself, Mr. John Laub. You can find John on Twitter at GridironSkull91. You can find his work over at the Fantrax HQ page, as well as his newly launched website celebrating college fantasy history, collegefantasyhalloffame.com. On his team, John drafted wide receiver out of Ohio State, Jeremiah Smith, Cameron Cook, the running back now at West Virginia. We have Bo Jackson, the running back out of Ohio State, Charlie Becker, the wide receiver out of Indiana, Sam Levitt, the quarterback out of LSU, Ian Strong, the wide receiver out of Cal, Jordan Davidson, the running back out of Oregon, Darian Mensah, the new quarterback at Miami of Florida, and finally his tight end, DJ Vaname, the tight end out of Iowa. John brings a ton of experience to this table, so I am going to be so glad to hear what he has to say, so go ahead, John.
Hello, CFF diehards. How are you? We are here again for the way too early draft with Jared. I appreciate you bringing me on once again. I think this is the 5th year. I'm not exactly sure. Time goes by rather quickly, but I'm John Laub, or otherwise known as the Gridiron Scholar. You can find all my college fantasy football information on Fantrax or at the College Fantasy Football Hall of Fame. You can find me on X at the Gridiron Skull 91. And in this amazing way too early draft, I had pick number 2. So I was kind of blown away. Usually I get stuck in the middle, but this year I was right in the beginning with pick number 2. And one of the first things that Jared asked us was, what do we think about this year's draft and the player pool itself? When I started doing my rankings, and I try to get like the top 50 players at every position before we begin the way too early draft, one of the things I noticed from my end right away, quarterbacks are pretty deep. Now, if you want the elite dual threat quarterbacks, you can argue that they're a little more shallow, but there are 34, 38 quarterbacks who I really like based on system, skill set, and everything like that. The running backs I feel pretty comfortable with. I felt like I can get some value in the running back position. Wide receiver, though, woo! That is going to be a thorn in the side of CFF owners this year. I really only feel comfortable with maybe 9 to 11 wide receivers. After that, you're banking on system. Maybe you're banking on talent. You're banking on opportunity and volume. There's not a lot to go on. You kind of have to pick, I think, your favorites when you're going deep into that 30 to 40 range at wide receiver. And then tight ends, man. Woo! The tight end is a complete crapshoot right now. I mean, I think I might have got a value, but you know what? We've seen the tight end position. It can be topsy-turvy. You might get a value at pick number 20 in the 20th round, 20th tight end off the board. There's no superstar that I can see. There's a couple systems you like at tight end, but there's no one who I think is a slam dunk no-brainer. So I was asked, who is my favorite pick? I'm going to go, it is Jordan Davison out of Oregon. I took him in the 7th round. He was one of the players, I think I'm going to be higher on him than most. Now, we haven't seen everyone's rankings. It's early in the process. But the fact that he was on the board in the 7th round was very enticing to me. If you look back, he was a freshman last season, and he sheared the backfield load. He had 113 carries, 667 yards, and 15 touchdowns for the Ducks. Now, 15 touchdowns might not be able to be replicated, but let's say he at least gets into the double digits once again. He also had 12 catches for 62 yards, which I really like. But here's where I think it's important. You have to look at advanced stats. I use PFF. You don't have to agree with everything they're grading, but it's a database of information. He had an 89.1 grade as a true freshman. He had 115 carries, I mentioned before. He had 15 carries over 10 yards. That's pretty spectacular for a true freshman. He also played equally out of zone and gap schemes. To ask a freshman to come in and play successfully out of both of those schemes is really impressive for me. Here's the stat I liked a ton. He had 45 first downs running the football. The coaching staff believed in this young man, and they gave him the football. Now, with the 2nd pick overall, I had Jeremiah Smith. I was happy he was on the board. I'm going to have him at number 1. 1 is the value of the position. The wide receiver position, I don't like a ton of the guys. I'm not confident in a ton of players. Jeremiah Smith, I don't know if his ceiling's 1,700 yards, but his floor is so high I think you're going to get 1,100 yards and double-digit touchdowns in a down year. We know that coaching staff is going to throw him the ball. He's got his quarterback returning. I love Jeremiah Smith. I took him at number 2. The value I like at wide receiver, I like Charlie Becker of Indiana. And I know this is going to be a debate within the offseason. First off, I got him as the second wide receiver off the board, so I like that, of Indiana. So I like that value. I believe in Kirk Cignetti. We just saw Elijah Surratt and we saw Omar Cooper. They were both very successful fantasy players last year. They're going to the NFL. Charlie Becker, despite those two players on the team, he had 34 catches, 679 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Since November 8th, so his beginning of the year was okay. Then he had a real lull in the middle. Since September 8th, Charlie Becker's box scores for fantasy production: 18.8, 21.8, his dud 1.6, 18.6, 13.1, 12.8, and 10.5 fantasy points per game. I love Charlie Becker. My eyeballs test loves him. I'm glad they brought in Nick Marsh. That is better for Charlie Becker. I want him to have one-on-one coverage deep down the field. I talked about the tight end position. I usually don't say a lot about the tight end, but there is one I kind of like. I took him as a sleeper in the last round. And I think, if my memory serves, we had like 7 tight ends go off in the last round, which is round 9. So everyone was kind of feeling like the tight end position is rather strong. It is DJ Vonnehem. I think that's his name if I'm mispronouncing it. For the Iowa Hawkeyes. I love the scheme, love the coaching staff. We know they're going to throw to the tight end. 29 catches, 434 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now, I'm not always convinced the bowl games matter, but I did catch the bowl game against Vanderbilt. And I thought Von Holm was amazing in that game. He had 27.6 fantasy points. The game before, he had 18.1. So we have a tight end who looks really gifted on the field, in the right scheme with the Iowa Hawkeyes, and he impressed me with the eyeball test. I think he'll be very good this year. I like him a ton. And my 2 quarterbacks, I was very happy. I waited till the 5th round. I might have waited a little bit late. I don't know if I love waiting till the 5th round anymore. But this time I took Sam Levitt from LSU. Hey, I'm banking on scheme and system. I know you can argue his deep balls aren't the best. You can argue maybe about arm strength. All I know, he was productive at Arizona State. The other thing I know, I believe in Lane Kiffin. What do you want me to tell you? Trinidad Chambliss and Jackson Dart have been very good fantasy college quarterbacks. I mean, Trinidad Chambliss was one of the best fantasy players on the waiver wire last year in Lane Kiffin's system. And Lane Kiffin went out and got Sam Levitt. You know what? I'm going to bank on Lane Kiffin that he's made a good decision, and Sam Levitt did great. He'll do great in that scheme. The other one, I don't think he'll last. One of the great questions Jared asks every year is, who will move up? I think Darian Mensah now signing with Miami. I got a little lucky. He was in the transfer portal. We weren't 100% sure where he landed. In the 8th round, I had to take Darian Mensah. He had 4 games over 30 fantasy points last year. He had 34 touchdowns and 3,973 passing yards. I think Darian Mensah is going to do better with the Miami Hurricanes. I love this draft. I like how my team came out. To finish off my team, I took Cameron Cook of West Virginia. I love him there. Bo Jackson of Ohio State, and Ian Strong out of California. Jared, I can't thank you enough for having me on, doing this way too early draft. It got me motivated to do my rankings, and I can't wait for college football to begin.
Thank you, John. Coming up is the brand new co-host of our own Chasing the Natty podcast and newest member of the Campus to Canton CFF team, Mr. Chris Battistel. You can find Chris on Twitter at FFChrisB, as well as on this very channel every week going forward. On his team, Chris drafted Caleb Hawkins, the running back out of Oklahoma State, Jaden Baugh, the running back out of Florida, Bafele Ashlock, the wide receiver out of Hawaii, Carson Hansen, the running back out of Penn State, wide receiver Chase Hendricks out of Cal, Jace Brown, the wide receiver out of LSU, Alonzo Barnett, the quarterback out of UCF, Deuce Knight, the quarterback out of Ole Miss, and then finally, his tight end, Dylan Wade out of UCF. All right, Chris, you're representing the show now, so show us what you got.
What's up, everybody? I'm Chris Battistel, one half of the Chasing the Natty podcast with Jared Palmgren. Thank you, Jared, for having me. This is my second way too early mock draft, and this year I picked out of the 103 slot. Getting to these questions, what is your general opinion of this year's pool of players? Is there anything unique compared to previous years? Once again, it's a running back year. The top end of drafts are going to be dominated by the position. I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one to mention this, but 50% of the first round was dominated by running backs. And when you combine the first and second round together, that number jumps to 62%. Of course, some of that can be skewed by the constricted roster construction in this draft. Jared made sure we hit a certain amount of positions and players. We only had 9 rounds. So drafting an elite running back at the top end was a focal point for me, at least. So that could be why the running back dominated this draft so much. But I'm expecting it as we go heavy into draft season to be some of the same. I'm expecting running backs to dominate almost every draft I'm going to be a part of this year. As for unique, maybe not right now, but I believe leagues at least will be won by nailing the middle to late round wide receivers. Guys like Shelton Sampson Jr., who was drafted by Eliot Mays in the 7th, Ryan Wingo out of Texas, drafted by Chris K in the 9th, and I was able to pick up Jace Brown in the 5th. The 3 players who could have the possibility of ending the season as the top target man on their teams, and ultimately top 15 fantasy wide receivers. So that could be kind of seen as unique, but I think that's where you're going to be able to walk out on top once the season is all said and done. Who's your favorite pick on your team, and which pick did you like the least? I have 3 real favorite picks on my team, although I like the QBs I was able to snag in Alonzo Barnett out of UCF and Deuce Knight out of Ole Miss. But Jace Brown, who Jared and I projected to walk out of LSU as the top wide receiver for the Tigers in 2026. Dylan Wade, the tight end out of UCF, who was an absolute stud down the stretch. And Chase Hendricks out of Cal. Both Cal wide receivers were picked. And if you go back to the transfer portal wide receiver episode that Jared and I broke down just a couple weeks ago, you can hear the full breakdown of why at least I think Chase Hendricks could be the guy that walks out of this Cal room as the number 1 target. As for pick I like the least, it didn't really come down to one player in general. It's just that maybe I read the room wrong. I really wanted to walk out with Cam Cook as my running back 2. And of course, drafting beside John Laub, the thorn in my side when it comes down to these draft rooms, I went with Jaden Bach, projecting that Cam Cook would be the running back that I see on the way back. Not saying that Bach would have been there either, but I am projecting Cam Cook to have a better fantasy season than Jaden. So that one hurt me a little bit. I wish I would have went with Cam Cook over Jaden Bach just in that situation. Then maybe Bafele Ashlock. Jaren's been kind of talking me down on the wide receiver. He is a target monster at Hawaii, but the fantasy output doesn't always equal what he sees on the field for Ashlock. Question number 3, what's something you do differently next time that's not picking someone beside your least favorite pick? Try to lobby not to be sandwiched between 2 goats of the game in John Laub and Eric Froton. I tried, but my cries just fell on silent ears. Unfortunately, I had to pick in between these 2 guys. honestly, other than reading the room wrong with that one pick, I don't think there was much I would have done differently. I nailed my draft plan. I was able to draft players that were on the top of my big board, and I think I walked out with a contender compared to what I drafted last season. And question number 4, which players do you expect to rise or fall in drafts as the year goes on? I expect it to balance out. I don't have a player in general, but I expect the wide receivers to kind of balance out the running backs as we move into June, July, and the beginning of August when we head into heavy draft season. There's a lot of guys like Cooper Barkate, Trey Richardson, Latier Brooks, Nate Marchese, who were drafted late in this draft that could see a run at being a top 20 player when it comes to ADP when all is said and done, when we're heading into the season. So I am expecting the wide receivers to kind of balance out. But yeah, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at with this draft. I think I did really well. I think I built a contender. Of course, Jared, thank you for having me in this early draft. It's never way too early to draft, by the way. So, but I'm Chris Battistel. Thank you again for watching or listening. You can find me at FFChrisB on X or on the Chasing the Natty podcast beside the wonderful, the great Jared Palmgren. Tell 2 friends to tell 2 friends.
Thank you so much, Chris. Up next is the man who knows how to get things done in the CFF world, including building and commissioning the largest tournament in the game now, the Tadpole Bowl. Mr. Eric Froton, you are up. You can find Froton on Twitter at CFFroton, and you can hear his lovely voice over on the CFF All Access podcast at Fantasy Points, as well as his great work for NBC Sports. On his team, Froton drafted Amari Thomas, wide receiver out of Houston, Isaac Brown, the running back out of Louisville, DeCorian Moore, the wide receiver out of Oregon, Dylan Riley, the running back out of Boise State, wide receiver Bryant Wesco out of Clemson, running back Ruben Owens out of Texas A&M, quarterback Dante Moore out of Oregon, as well as Jaden Mayava out of USC, and then finally his tight end pick, Patrick Overmeyer, the new tight end over at Houston. Take it away, Froton.
Froton here, live on location at the Ocean Beach Pier. We just had another majestic Southern California sunset. Gosh, we've been getting a snap of some incredible weather, everyone, but that's not why we're here. See, we had the first college fantasy football draft of the 2026 campaign, thanks to my friend and yours, the great Jared Palmgren, Chasing the Natty. Please subscribe and like. And I'd like to talk about my team and what I see or saw around the league. So, I believe the first question was, what kind of a trends did we notice in this first draft? It was certainly a running back top heavy. Say those first 3 rounds, everybody's scrambling to get a number 1 or in a lot of cases number 2 running back, and there were some good ones, of course. Quarterbacks are plentiful. I'll get into it a little later, but there were some excellent players, obviously, that didn't get drafted. One in mind that was a QB, and even at the back end, saw some guys like Jaden Mayava I felt pretty good about that, and others that were still available. So, and then with wide receivers, you got to remember, this is the very early going. We have no camp buzz to go off of. We can project depth charts, but until they get out there and play, and we actually get a post-spring sort of idea of what we're dealing with, that it's going to be really conjecture with the wide receivers. As everyone knows, the most volatile position in college fantasy football to project. So with that obviously in mind. And with the tight ends, most of them went at the end. I was pretty happy with my selection, but just a pretty darn good group. Saw Terrence Carter go first, I can't really argue with that. But I do feel like we have a pretty deep group in this year's class once we start getting into the 20-plus round type drafts. Who was I surprised to see go undrafted? Gunnar Stockton for good old Georgia. I mean, the guy had 462 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns last year. I know he got 2 extra games, but to go with 24 passing touchdowns with 5 interceptions. I mean, he had 20 points in 8 of the last 10 games. in 6-point passing touchdown formats, the only formats anybody should be playing, of course. So that's what only surprised me. And if there's a player I think will move up the board, I'm going to go with Cam Coleman over there in Texas. Everyone loves Arch. He's the front runner for the Heisman Award, and with him in town, I mean, I just think his Truex profile is going to play. I like Wingo, of course, who also went, but there's a reason why they cleared out that wide receiver room. Parker Livingston leaving, as did Mr. Agent Zero, DeAndre Moore. So that's how I feel about this particular draft. I had a blast. Thank you very much for inviting me. Again, Jared, great job by everybody. I look forward to competing with you again in 2026, which is going to be, and I promise, the best year ever for college fantasy football. That's an Eric Froton personal guarantee.
Thank you, Eric. Up next is another member of the elite team here at Campus of Canton, as well as host of the Ballin' With My Bestie and Bernie the Red Shirt podcast, Mr. Chris K. You can find Chris on Twitter at RealistChrisK. For his team, Chris K picked Mr. Ahmad Hardy, the running back out of Missouri, wide receiver Isaiah Satania out of Oklahoma, running back Wayman Jordan out of USC, running back Mark Fletcher out of Miami of Florida, quarterback Connor Wigman out of Houston, wide receiver Anthony Evans out of Mississippi State, tight end Trades Green out of LSU, quarterback Marcel Reed out of Texas A&M, and then finally, wide receiver Ryan Wingo out of Texas. All right, Chris, what do you got for us?
What's going on, everybody? Another way too early mock is in the books. What is this? 2 or 3 years now I've done this, and I haven't come close to winning. Let's just put it that way. I would be surprised if I look back in 12 months and say that my team was the worst, only because I drafted people that have been on the team with the same system that we know what we're getting. So every single one of my picks was on the team previously and had done fairly well at the very least. Maybe the floor is high. Maybe the ceiling is capped. We shall see. But looking forward to what the season has in store for us. Thank you again, Jared, for putting this on. You know, when I look at this year's group, kind of the same story as always, right? Quarterbacks at this stage in the game seem great. There's a ton of them that we feel good about. When you look at other positions, running back, receiver, I feel really good about running back, as we can see from the draft results. Tons of running backs early, receivers kind of thinned out early, and then we get a big group of them there towards the end. Curious to see what this would look like if this was a true 30-round draft. But I think everybody likes some receivers, but in pinpointing who that next guy up is, it feels like maybe currently there's just a bunch of receiver 5 through 30 is very tightly, is very close or something to that extent. Then looking at tight ends, I mean, same story, new year, right? I think tight ends just continue to be an interestingly average group. At least last year we had Sadiq and Stowers. Could they take it to the next level of that Tyler Warren cheat code level? I don't see anybody doing that this year. I think there's some interesting tight ends. I think there's guys that I like, but I don't think there's any of them necessarily worth being taken in the second or third round, let's say, of our Champion Series tight end premium leagues. Maybe in the summer we'll see that, but I don't see anybody currently that really jumps out at me from that perspective. You know, speaking of tight ends, my favorite pick was Trades Green, my tight end from LSU. This guy has only played, I believe, 15 games the last 2 seasons, but he has 11 touchdowns. He had 7 and 8 games last year, 11 touchdowns on 75 total targets the last 2 years. Like, this guy is a touchdown machine, athletic enough, big size. I think with Sam Levitt in town, I think that'll be great for him. You know, Mateer from Arizona State last couple of years had success. I think that's a really good quarterback pairing for Trades here. And so I like him here. You know, I'm privy and I'm focused in on underdog drafts, of course. So those are tight ends need to score touchdowns, and hence what I kind of brought up for Trades. He scores touchdowns. So I'm a big fan of that pick. Pick I don't love necessarily is going to be Mark Fletcher. Didn't want to slow us down. I like Fletcher, generally speaking, but 408 is a little bit rich. I'm curious to see where he'll be taken in these first real drafts. Issues with him, not a ton of receiving work. and the sporadic usage. We saw him be used heavily in the playoffs. Will we see that again? Will we see that continue in 2026? Not necessarily sure there. So we'll see. The people say the room is crowded. It is technically, but is this offense going to be good enough to just rotate in a bunch of running backs? I don't necessarily think it is going to be that much better and beating up on teams by that much that is a big impact. So looking at the draft in terms of draft strategy, I think early on, hit your flex guys because quarterback is so known. We have tons of different quarterbacks that we were aware of that we feel good about. Target your flex guys early. And then I think as these battles become more clear, as the G5 guys become more clear, you can then start to take your quarterbacks early and maybe push some of those flex guys a little bit later in the draft. One thing to note, this year's draft had 18 total G5 players taken. Last year, 25. Curious what that is. You have to ask Justice for that one. It's above my head, and I don't necessarily do G5 like that. So, but yeah, I think looking at what I would do differently, I wouldn't necessarily say I would do anything other than maybe target a receiver earlier. My second receiver is Anthony Evans. My third is Ryan Wingo. I don't hate the picks, and theoretically, you'd have a lot of rounds to maybe hammer a receiver in these mid rounds to give yourself some shot. But I think, taking receiver early does make sense if you love a guy because there are a lot of different running back options out there. Thank you again, Jared, for hosting. Looking forward to 12 months from now when we run this back again and seeing what we come up with. Until then, guys, enjoy and good luck.
Thank you again, Kay. Up next is another veteran of the CFF space, Mr. Joe Arpasi. You can find Joe on Twitter at CFR_Joe, as well as his great work over on his website, collegefantasyrain.com. For his team, Joe picked running back Cameron Dickey out of Texas Tech, running back Lucky Sutton out of San Diego State, wide receiver KJ Duff out of Rutgers, running back Wayne Knight out of UCLA, quarterbacks Drew Messenmaker of Oklahoma State, as well as Byron Brown out of Auburn, tight end Benjamin Brahmer out of Penn State, wide receiver Keyshawn Singleton out of Auburn, as well as wide receiver David Amador out of UTSA. All right, Joe, the floor is yours, man.
What's up, everybody? I am Joe Arpasi from College Fantasy Rain. We're kicking off 2026 with this way too early mock draft, and it was a good time, guys. I took some time off from CFF work and had to jump back into things here with this draft kicking off. It pretty much was a diving in headfirst experience for me compared to the normal prep that I do. I did not have a well fleshed out set of player rankings done like the ones that I will be posting later this month on College Fantasy Rain. So I didn't have a great feel for how all the position groups would shake out during this draft. And I'm going to just kind of go through some of the observations I made while doing this draft. After completing this, I noticed that there is an abundance of good quarterbacks that you could wait on. I do think that this group of drafters probably waited longer than what you are likely to see in your spring drafts. It's just kind of a gut feeling there, so do keep that in mind. I always like to emphasize, get yourself reliable running backs early in a draft, which I did here again. All but one of these teams in the draft had drafted their third and final running back by round 7. And with this draft, only 7 running backs made it past the first 4 rounds. So that's kind of a big observation to me, especially that just within those first handful of 4 rounds, man, running backs were definitely going off the board and people were filling those up. So it looks like the running back position will probably flow like it normally does in drafts past. And the thing I think was more surprising to me was the wide receiver position. There were 6 wide receivers taken in the first round, and all of them, with the exception of Malachi Toney, have their QBs returning in 2026. In fact, 9 of the first 10 wide receivers taken had their quarterbacks returning. I do feel like the well dried up pretty quick for known guys at wide receiver that don't have several question marks this year. The tight end position is one that I think is rough this year. It was kind of rough last year, guys. I don't know if it's going to get much better. Of the players that I view as kind of leading candidates to be my top 10 guys, there's several of them that I consider projection plays. It's hard to find a tight end that has proven production and they're returning in the same offensive system. That is why I jumped on Benjamin Brahmer in the 7th round. I think you should prioritize a proven dude at tight end this year, and I waited until 3 tight ends had gone off the board before I struck and got mine. I normally have waited until around 8 or 9 to pull the trigger on a tight end in this draft format, and I'm glad I jumped up 1 round to do so for getting Brahmer. I always like going running back heavy. I've mentioned that already. But looking back, I wish I would have drafted 2 running backs and 2 receivers in my first 4 picks. I would have had a bit more balance, I feel, within my lineup instead of locking down all of my running backs by round 4. KJ Duff was my 1 wide receiver that I took. I took him off the board in round 3. I like his proven production history, but he is getting a new quarterback this season, which could impact his fantasy output. You know, if I would have reached up a bit higher, I really do think going like running back, receiver, running back for those first 3 rounds would have been the better way to go. I could have gotten myself a guy that has proven production and not the same question marks. So having said that about my wide receiver approach, I am happy to have landed Keyshawn Singleton and David Amador with my last 2 picks. Both have different levels of past fantasy production, and what I really like is both of them are returning their QBs and they're playing in the same offensive system they played in last year. That just leaves the quarterback position, which is another area I would have tweaked this draft. I like pulling the trigger on Mestamaker in the 5th round. 5 QBs had gone off the board before my pick, and 2 of the 4 picks before mine were QBs. I felt a run might be starting, and so I went ahead and I just grabbed my guy. When my next pick came rolling around, only 3 more QBs went off the board. I really should have waited on QB here and gone for another receiver, then grabbed my last quarterback in round 8 after that Benjamin Brahmer pick in the 7th. So when I evaluate my draft performance, I would say that my favorite pick was Brahmer in the 7th because of just how bad I think this tight end position is going to be, and you really need to get yourself an anchor that's proven and reliable. My least favorite pick would have to be selecting a running back in round 2 instead of a receiver. I had mentioned that before. I always like the 2 running back, 1 wide receiver approach for the first 3 rounds. A lot of times I'll go running back, receiver like I did in this draft. But I really do. I think it wasn't the smartest pick. Once I got in it and I started looking at these receivers, I think that you are going to have to push up the receivers a little bit here and doing a running back, receiver, running back approach. You know, I'm just now going and getting into my 2026 work. I can see a few things that I will lean on when it comes to my draft strategy for this year. The first thing, count on players with proven production over projection plays. Number 2, keep a focus for players in fantasy productive coaching systems. Number 3, every player I took in this draft has previous production with the same coaching system that they were in the year before. So my number 3 is kind of a combining the first 2 points. You know, if you can get proven guys and they're in a good coaching system and they're returning in that coaching system again, that's going to be a great start as you're starting out your draft. Number 4, work out the first 4 rounds with 2 running backs and 2 receivers to create some balance at the running back position. My 5th observation is grab your QB1 at the right time, then wait before going back to that position. You don't have to rush getting that second quarterback. And number 6, reach up a little to get a proven tight end guy, then roll the dice on production plays late in your draft. It was really great doing this draft, and I want to thank Jared Palmgren for hosting this event once again. You do an amazing job, Jared. Thank you so much. I can't wait to finish up my way too early player rankings for everyone, which will be out later this month. You'll be able to access it at collegefantasyrain.com. College football is back for 2026. Let's go, baby.
Appreciate you so much, Joe. Up next is a new face for the Way Too Early special, and that is Mr. Eliot Mays, also known as Bacon Fueled. You can find Eliot on Twitter at Eliot Mays, and you can find him appearing on the CFF All Access podcast over there at Fantasy Points. Eliot, for his team, drafted Mr. Jordan Marshall, the running back out of Michigan, running back Jalen Buckley out of Western Michigan, wide receiver Tanuk Hines out of USC, wide receiver Amarian Miller out of Arizona State, tight end Jamari Johnson out of Oregon, running back Aeneas Williams out of Notre Dame, wide receiver Shelton Sampson Jr. out of Louisiana, and finally he finished up with two quarterbacks in John Mateer of Oklahoma, as well as Bear Bachmeier out of BYU. We always love hearing from new voices, so Eliot, tell us what you saw in this draft.
What's going on, everyone? Eliot Mays here from Fantasy Points. When I am not knee-deep in spreadsheets, you can find me over on X at Eliot Mays. That's ELIOT MAYS. I have to start out by giving a huge shout-out to Jared for finally letting me into the Way Too Early club. This is my first year being invited to the draft, and honestly, it kind of feels a bit like being invited to the cool kids table at lunch. But honestly, I'm mostly just trying not to spill my juice or get stuffed in a locker by Froton. So I was drafting from the 7 spot this year, which I thought was a great place to kind of watch the chaos unfold and kind of provide time to try and find value as the board came to me. Looking at the 2026 pool, it's a very different vibe compared to the last couple of years. As far as quarterbacks are concerned, I feel it's pretty deep, at least to me. There's a lot of continuity with guys returning or staying in established systems. So you aren't really guessing as much of who the guy is. Regarding running backs, I think it's actually a pretty decent spot. We have more knowns than we usually do this early in the cycle, I feel like. Wide receivers, this is where it gets obviously a little more dicey. It's not that there's a scarcity of talent per se, but they're, between the transfer portal, some of these crowded wide receiver rooms, the level of certainty in many of these players is really not spectacular. So tight ends, I'm probably a little more on an island here, but I feel like they're pretty thin. I'm confident in maybe 5 or 6 guys right now. But similar to last year, I really don't see any game breakers who are going to single-handedly win you a league. But if you don't get one of those top few, you're basically kind of throwing darts and hoping to hit. So let's talk a little bit about my squad. My favorite pick was probably, I'm pretty high on Jordan Marshall at Michigan. I picked him in the first round, and, he put up over 900 yards, 6.2 yards per attempt, 10 touchdowns, 0 fumbles as a freshman. And that Michigan offense is really built to let a guy like him eat. I received a text from Bainbridge shortly after the pick, so anytime I can put Mike on tilt, I consider that a win. So I also love snagging Shelton Sampson late. He led the Raging Cajuns in pretty much every receiving category last year, and getting that kind of production in the 7th round, it feels pretty solid. Feels like a pretty solid get to me. So my least favorite, if I had to pick kind of a meh moment, it's probably Amarian Miller in the 4th. Look, the talent's there. The guy had 800 yards, or had an 800-yard season. He's been super efficient the last 2 years. But the 4th round felt a little rich in hindsight. All of all my players, he's really the one that has the most uncertainty tied to him. The Sun Devils are looking to fill pretty big shoes with Tyson heading to the NFL, and they brought in 3 receivers that I think are all very talented. Obviously Miller, Vinesbright from Washington, Reed Harris from Boston College, who I'm also a huge fan of. and combine that with Cutter Boley coming in to lead the pass attack, and there's certainly some questions that need to be answered. And having said that, I'm probably a bit more optimistic in Boley and his arm talent than most. So looking back just from a strategic perspective, is there anything I would do differently? I came into this draft with a pretty, with a game plan. My game plan was basically to hit wide receiver and running back early. I did want to be one of the first ones to grab a tight end before the drop off. And then my plan was to punt quarterback to the absolute end. And I really obviously stuck to that. I grabbed the first tight end off the board with Jamari Johnson and was the last to roster both quarterbacks in the last 2 rounds. But looking back, I probably could have waited another round or 2 on tight end and still landed someone I liked. But, overall, I feel pretty solid about my team. I would be happy going into the season with this squad, at least with the info we currently have. So, just kind of in looking at the draft as a whole, as far as risers, fallers, that kind of thing, I feel as we head towards spring, the whole wide receiver market really is going to be a roller coaster. Once we get some camp news, some portal dust, finally completely settles, I think we're likely to break out the eraser for half of our player rankings probably. And I also want to tip my cap to a few other drafters who I think really crushed it with some guys that I think probably are going to be some risers. Nate getting Parker Kingston and then Kamario Taylor late. I was really hoping Taylor would fall to me in that final round with my late QB strategy, as he's someone I'll likely have a pretty decent exposure to. Mike Bainbridge, he put together a rock solid team with Mekhi Hughes and McClure from Tulane, and then getting Avery Johnson where he did, I thought all of that was great value. Josh, grabbing Brad Jackson, Lottie Brooks, and Adam Muhammad, I thought was all very strong. Jackson was the first quarterback off the board by 2 full rounds, but honestly, that's probably right where he deserves to be. So, had a lot of fun. Glad I got the invite. Thanks for having me, Jared, and can't wait to see how wrong we all are come August.
Thank you for joining us this year, Eliot. Coming up now is Justin Leo, aka Volume Pigs. You can find him on Twitter at Volume Pigs, and you can find his great work on his website over at volumepigs.com, as well as some exclusive articles of his over at campusofcanton.com. For his team, VP drafted running back Antoine Raymond out of Rutgers, Deshaun Bishop, the running back out of Tennessee, running back Austin Dendy out of Bowling Green, quarterback Devin Dampier out of Utah, and then 3 wide receivers here in Mario Craver of Texas A&M, Cam Coleman of Texas, and Braden Pegan of Utah. He then drafted his tight end in J.J. Buchanan out of Michigan, and he finished it up with a quarterback pick in Braxton Woodson of Navy. All right, VP, it's all you, man. What do you got for us?
Hello, world. Hello, Jared. This is Justin Leo, also known as VP at Volume Pigs on Twitter. You can find my work at www.volumepigs.com. Thank you once again, Jared, for inviting me to your way too early mock draft. It was a lot of fun, as always. And my pick in this draft was the 8th pick. Alrighty. So Jared has prepared a set of 3 required questions and some optional questions. I'll tackle his first question first. And his question is, what is my opinion of the player pool this year? Is there anything unique about it compared to years past? I don't think it's really a unique player pool this year in the sense of it reminds me a lot of 2024's player pool. And I think it is one of those cyclical things, maybe even more so now with NIL and the transfer portal, where you see a lot more players that could leave or returning. And I think it might be sort of one of those 2-year cycle things where whenever you have a great year at running back, which I think we have a really good year here in 2026 at running back, the following year is not so great. Or you could sort of reverse that and say, well, if 2025, if one year is not so great, then the following year is probably going to be really good. Whichever way you look at it. 2024 was one of those great years at running back. This past season, there was a lot of turnover there, and so that just meant a lot of uncertainty. You didn't really know really what to expect in a lot of running back rooms. This year, there's not as much uncertainty, even with players transferring around. I think in a lot of backfields, there's, a name, at least one name, a known commodity, a lot of the starters who are returning. So I think it's a great year at running back, which I don't know if that's great for me as a drafter. Typically I think I've been better in years where there's more uncertainty at running back, just because I think the skill gap kind of increases then in terms of finding good players, finding hits in the CFF perspective. Whereas when there's less turnover, the average drafter kind of has a better understanding and idea of where those good running backs are. So yeah, maybe that's an unfortunate thing for me, but overall I think it's a great group of running backs this year, and so that's something to be excited about. All right, so second question. He asks, who is my favorite pick on my team? Who is my least favorite pick on my team? Favorite pick, I'm going to kind of go for wild card here. A position that I don't usually think about that much in these drafts, to be honest. The tight end position. I picked J.J. Buchanan, tight end, rising sophomore tight end at Michigan. What do I like about him? So he was pretty good at Utah last year, despite the fact that they had a lot of different tight end pieces. They had a bunch of different sort of utility players doing all kinds of different things. But at tight end, for sure, Dallin Bentley was sort of their main guy. And they had sort of Hunter Andrews early in the year before he went down. You had Otto Tia as well, kicking around. But Buchanan sort of came on strong, particularly towards the end of the season. Had pretty good target volume throughout the year, but definitely at the end of the season had a good finish. And then was one of the few players that was taken from that Utah system over to Michigan with Jason Beck, OC, and head coach Kyle Whittingham, which to me is a good indicator. That system as well, that tight end under Whittingham, even though, it's Jason Beck who's the OC, but forever that, Whittingham's been there at Utah, the tight end has usually been a good spot. The Utah tight end, when he was there, was usually a good one to sniff around for CFF value. And I expect that will be the case again this year at Michigan. Now, Michigan itself as a program, sorry guys, is also a great one for tight end production. And so it is kind of a nice marriage there. And I do think Buchanan's going to be probably peppered with targets in that offense. Still with a young quarterback, not a freshman anymore, but still a young Bryce Underwood, who could use all the help he can get in that offense. And I think sort of Buchanan could be, I actually do think he will be a player who rises in the offseason in ADP. We don't really have any ADP, but rises sort of in the, in the conversation of top tight ends this offseason as more and more people sort of make their way through their offseason research. I spoke about running backs a lot in the previous question. I think tight end is sort of the opposite of that this year. There's really a lot of turnover, and it typically is a position that there's not really a lot of great returning options, just because there's not a lot of great options in general. And I think when you look at that tight end group and then where guys stack up, I think Buchanan's probably, in my mind, one of the top guys. And if you're someone who wants to draft tight ends earlier, I would expect he'll probably be a riser as drafts sort of go on throughout the offseason. Least favorite pick, it's hard to isolate. It's hard to pick one. I love them all. I'm just such a great drafter. No, I mean, I don't know. It's in this draft you're constrained. You have to only pick 3 running backs, for example, three receivers total. Two quarterbacks and 1 tight end. If I had to isolate one, I mean, there's no really receiver that I really liked. I don't know. Braden Pegan is one I picked, who's following his OC, Kevin McGlynn from Utah State, and Utah's replacing, some of their, Ryan Davis in particular, wide receiver 1 is leaving. And so, there is an opening there, but when you get these G5 to P4 guys, it's not quite as bad at wide receiver, but there is always this uncertainty, and the hit rate has been pretty hit or miss. No pun intended there. And so Pegan's just one of those guys where the range of outcomes I feel like is quite wide. The other 2 receivers I took, Cam Coleman and Craver, I feel pretty confident about like there's going to be starters in those offenses. Whereas Pegan, it's like, well, he might not even start right at Utah, just because he's there with his former OC doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a starter. And even if he is a starter, he might not be wide receiver one. And so, yeah, he's one where it's like, okay, he's kind of a wild card. I don't really know what to expect with him. But, if he hits, he could be could be decently productive in that new offense now. Obviously, they have a returning quarterback in Devin Dampier, and that was kind of part of why I think I was looking at Utah receiver, because I already selected Devin as one of my quarterbacks. So, yeah, favorite pick, J.J. Buchanan. Least favorite, Braden Pegan. Okay, so third question Jared asks is, what is something I would do differently that is not selecting the least favorite pick? Yeah, well, I mean, I've done these drafts for a few years now, and I don't really know what I usually answer. Maybe I've in the past, I think Jared's footnote there might be because I've in the past just said I wouldn't select who my least favorite pick was, possibly. Outside of that, I don't know exactly. I mean, I do remember last year I'd sort of switched up my strategy in terms of like the ordering of positions. Now, I'm not like super hard-coded in terms of you have to draft 3 running backs first. I think last year I selected a receiver, a running back, and a quarterback as my first 3 picks. And that kind of, I don't know, it sort of helps see where some of the other running backs that you may be interested in would fall if you didn't select them. I am kind of intentional when I do these drafts not to select players I love a lot, and just because you do want to see where do some of these other experts value those players before you get into real drafts. Not that I dislike in particular the 3 running backs I took, but they weren't necessarily the ones that, if this was a real draft, that I would have selected in each of those selections. So yeah, I think probably switching up the strategy just for the sake of doing so. Maybe trying, like, I don't know, take 2 QBs first just to switch things up and see how other players would draft around that, maybe. But outside of that, I mean, I don't know. There's not really a lot of things I would have done differently about this draft. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. We're drafting in January. There's still so much unknown. And, one of the things I really wanted to make sure I did in this draft was just select players that I could be fairly confident in are going to start next year, right? Whether they're returning starters or there's some kind of NIL indicator there. Really wanted to, in a time in the offseason where there's so much uncertainty, I think certainty was at a premium. And that was something I sort of prioritized just for the sake of the exercise and trying to do it sort of properly. Once again, I didn't really go after or select players that I was really, really wanting, just because I wanted to know where they'd get drafted if I didn't draft them. So yeah, there's not really much I'd do differently. Probably just maybe switch up from my regular draft strategy to something else, just to keep things fresh and see how others would draft around that. Okay, so now for some of the optional questions, and I'll just tackle them briefly. So Jared's laid out 3. I'll talk about 2 of the 3. One of them is, are there any players you were surprised to see undrafted in this past draft? And which players, if any, are you expecting to rise, fall within the player pool that was drafted? One of the things I guess I was surprised to see is one of the Tennessee receivers drafted, but not the other. So Braylon Staley got drafted, and that, I was expecting that. He's a good player. But then Mike Matthews didn't end up getting drafted in this player pool. Again, it's a restricted, this is a 9-round draft. We're also only drafting 3 receivers per team within those 9 rounds. So, obviously that affects things, but, maybe that was one thing I was surprised about. In terms of risers and fallers, I think there's so many where, because we're drafting in January, right, there's a lot of uncertainty in a lot of these situations, and so you just can't, in good conscience, really draft some of these players who, like at LSU, for example, that wide receiver room. I think if you knew ahead of time who was wide receiver 1 there, probably that player is getting drafted in the top 3 rounds. I think Jace Brown was the first LSU receiver drafted, if I remember correctly. I don't remember him going in the first 3 rounds. I think he was later in the draft, but he's one where, him or another player, but I'll just talk about him for example. I think he's sort of the favorite in terms of CFFers' expectations this offseason to be wide receiver one there. I think if there's information in camp, right, in spring camp, fall camp, suggesting that he's, going to be the alpha of that wide receiver room, then, he's going to rise up boards quite precipitously. So there's a lot of situations like that. I think running back is the position where we don't have a lot of uncertainty this year, and so a lot of those players are getting selected early because we know who's a starter, who's returning there. At wide receiver, at tight end, even at quarterback, there's more turnover, and at wide receiver, there's a lot of rooms. I think this year LSU is one of them where you're not exactly sure who's going to be the alpha yet, and when you're drafting this early out, right, you have to price that in terms of if there's uncertainty there, that immediately cuts the value of that player, that role. Even if the role historically is great, if you don't know who's going to be in that role, you can't presume to know, right? So you're taking a chance there with anybody you draft in that room and rooms like that. So yeah, those are a couple of things that came to mind.
Thank you, Justin. Always a pleasure. Up next is the duo from the CFF Lists account, Jeremy Miller and Willie Barnett. You can find their very helpful CFF graphics over on Twitter at CFF Lists. For their team, the duo drafted wide receiver out of Texas State, Bo Sparks. Followed that up with running back Justice Haynes, now at Georgia Tech. They grabbed then Deuce Robinson, wide receiver out of Florida State. And then got Jaden Thomas, the running back out of UNLV. They took their two quarterbacks in Brennan Sorsby out of Texas Tech and Nick Minicucci out of Delaware. They then picked Fluff Bothwell out of Mississippi State. And then finished off with Iverson Hooks, wide receiver out of Oregon. And then their tight end, Garrett Oakley of Kansas State. Gentlemen, the mic is yours. What do you got?
Welcome, everybody, to this CFF list breakdown of our picks and Jared Palmgren's way too early mock draft. We are happy to be invited, be part of the crew that's providing some extra early insight on the players we think would be the best for 2026. I'm Jay Mill. I got my partner, Willie B, as usual. We are the CFF Lists duo. You can find us on Twitter or X at CFF Lists, and you can find us on Instagram at College Fantasy Football. Willie, how you doing today?
A little technical difficulties getting started, but we're going to try to zip through this, hopefully.
Well, I know I was really happy with the outcome of our draft. I mean, we picked guys for a reason because we have them ranked high in these early rankings. We are put to the test early of trying to sort through who's moved where. Hopefully people have caught our latest series, to try to get them up to date on who's gone to the NFL, who's out of eligibility, all the transfers, which are at record numbers now. Thank you for, getting all of that transfer work done on our spreadsheet. But when all was said and done, we had pick 1.09, and right out of the box, we decided to go wide receiver with Bo Sparks. One of the reasons is, there's a similar theme to the last couple of years that I believe we agree on, Willie, which is the quarterback depth seems to be there again for 2026. Last year, you had a ton of quarterbacks over 20 points per game. I think at least 65 quarterbacks. You had over 20 quarterbacks with 25 points a game. So there hasn't been any shortage of good quality quarterbacks that you can grab. So we took the strategy of going running backs and wide receivers, kind of splitting them evenly. We don't really see a difference in the receiving and running back category as far as one being weaker than the other. So, we didn't jump on getting 2 or 3 receivers or 2 and 3 running backs. We just kind of went even until it was time to take some quarterbacks. I think that first pick with Bo Sparks, Willie, was one of our best. We took him first for a reason. We both had him in our top 3 receivers. I think only bettered by Jeremiah Smith and maybe Malachi Toney, but I actually even had him as my number one guy that I wanted. We couldn't get the other 2 anyways because Smith and Toney were gone, but he's got his quarterback coming back from Texas State, which is another reason I was really high on him. But anything else you want to add about our number one pick, Bo Sparks, which I believe is both of our favorite pick even at the end? We have no regrets taking him in the first round, do we?
We really needed to get somebody that was going to be in our top 3, so really happy about that.
We jumped in then and got Justice Haynes, around when it came back around to us on the corner. We had the 9th pick, so we ended up getting the 4th pick in the second round. Just to remind everybody, in 7 games last year, he had 857 yards and 10 touchdowns. I think he was averaging like 7-something yards a carry. He was able to put up those kind of numbers in the Big Ten. Now he's moving to the ACC, which we feel just in general is probably a weaker conference. Wouldn't you agree, Willie?
Yeah, like you were just saying, if he gets an extra 5 games, let's put some stats on top of that. So I have him in my top 5. So I was really happy that we were able to get him with the amount of running backs that we're taking.
And getting Deuce Robinson as our second receiver in the third round. Jaden Thomas he missed a couple of games also last year. He only ended up in 10 games, still managed to get close to 1,000 yards. But what I really liked about him, and I think we both mutually agreed there that was going to be a good running back too, was his 32 catches in 2025. So it's something to keep an eye on, are those running backs capable of getting, 30 to 40 catches as your bonus points. Then the third running back was Fluff Bothwell, which we kind of made a decision along the way that each of us would kind of be granted permission to take one player without consulting the other too much. I let you grab Iverson Hooks as our third receiver because you were really high on him. You could elaborate on that in just a second. But in exchange, and I kind of made that decision on running back 3 with Fluff Bothwell, or kind of our flex player. I think he's going to be a lot better this year. Even though he was still very good last year, he was sharing carries with Davin Booth. Booth is gone. Bothwell proved he could make that transition from the group of 5 from South Alabama up to the Power 4. So I think there's a lot more potential there for Bothwell to really shine. He's was still a young guy last year. But yeah, more interestingly, tell us about Iverson Hooks. And, I was kind of down after getting burned in last year's mock draft and in a couple of real drafts on the group of 5 receivers that do jump up to P4. They're not panning out too well or at a high frequency. But what do you think is going to be different that can give Hooks the ability to transfer, that 17.5 points a game he had at UAB over to Oregon?
Well, I think it's just because of the school that he's going to. Oregon is going to do what they do. You got Decorian Moore, who's there, who was a true freshman. They're around the same size. I mean, so Decorian Moore had 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. So Hooks, he had 72 catches, 900 yards and 7. They had 4 guys leave, and so if we're going to draft Dante Moore, who is he throwing to? So it's worth that chance to take him where we took him. But I'm really high on him because I'm high on the offense. I just don't think that school is just going to fall flat on their face and then not compete. So that's why I'm just really high on him. I'm not worried about the jump.
Yeah, it makes sense. You're going with the system. The entire receiving core was really young last year, so he's got as good a chance as anybody. Is what I hear you saying. Why can't it be him? And Sadiq's gone at tight end, so they're going to have some extra targets there to throw around. At tight end, we were both really happy to get a guy that we had, I think, in our top 3 or 4 each, and that's Garrett Oakley coming back to Kansas State. Same quarterback. Shouldn't see his numbers drop off much at all. He was tight end 13 last year, managed 10 points a game, which is what you dream of. When you get a tight end, we see absolutely no reason he can't replicate that number. He may not do much better, but we'd all be really happy just to land a guaranteed 10-point tight end, right, Willie?
Oh, absolutely. And like say, a top 5 tight end for me, is like you said. I mean, if you can get 10 out of your tight end, that's all you can just dream for, because otherwise you're just throwing darts against the walls.
Right.
Happy to get him there.
We'll finish with a little discussion on our quarterbacks, who we're really happy to get. In hindsight, Jared likes to ask, if there's anything we do different. We got 2 great ones because we decided to grab Sorsby in the 5th round, and then we double back. I think maybe I know maybe being a little bit lazy, not wanting to look down the list at the other positions, and said, let's just grab our second quarterback now and get Minicucci. I think in hindsight, we could have waited because, you're looking at guys that went undrafted like Bear Bachmeier from BYU, Jennings from SMU. Those guys could very well be just as good as at least Minicucci, who finished at QB 13 last year. I don't know that they could match what we think Sorsby's going to do this year. We're really excited about him going to Texas Tech. But, as much as we kind of championed Minicucci as the season rolled along last year, I think it was exciting to grab him to also prove a point. We had him on the waiver watch every single week last year, and only in I think, week 13 did he get over 30% rostered. But in hindsight, if we could do it again, probably would have just waited till rounds 7 and 8 to take quarterbacks, even instead of 5 and 6, maybe. But I'm very happy with who we ended up with, at quarterback.
Yeah, but who would you have taken there? I mean, so you're going to get rid of Fluff Bothwell and take another running back if we didn't take Minicucci?
The upgrade would have been, I was a little disappointed. I like the Kendrick Raphael move from Cal to SMU. We missed out on him. The other one we missed out on that I was probably thinking I would have really liked to get and might have changed quarterback picks because of this is Davison from Oregon, the true freshman from last year who started coming along, especially towards the end of the season. But that's kind of what you're looking at. If we had waited another round or two to get our second quarterback, we might get a Kendrick Raphael or Davison instead of Bothwell. Not a huge difference, but Bear Bachmeyer over Minicucci is not a huge difference either, and that's what we would have downgraded to at quarterback. So I guess I'll leave it with that.
I think the reason is and why we didn't do that is because you still knew that I was wanting hooks, so we wouldn't have double dipped the Oregon train there. So
that's true.
I fully understand that. So
but
I still think we're happy with what we ended up.
Yeah. Last question. I just mentioned Bear Bachmeyer as a player we were surprised was there at the end of the draft. Another one on the negative side. Bachmeyer should have been drafted, in my opinion, but the surprising one that was remaining at the end was wide receiver 1 from last year, Danny Scudero, because of his move to Colorado. Any thoughts on that? Like, why did we all avoid Scudero?
Well, I mean, I think everyone is just so down with the way Colorado performed last year. So with all the additions that they're getting, you're still not sure what you're going to get, especially out of the quarterback position, which is going to lead to the wide receivers. So he can be open all he wants, but he still has to be able to have somebody get him the ball.
There you go.
And they just didn't have that last year.
I actually misspoke. He was wide receiver 3 last year, technically, with 23 points a game, but still amazing. In a 9-round draft, nobody was willing to go near Scudero, and that's your G5 guy going to P4 that a lot of people are scared about now.
Right. I mean, you're looking at Julian Wilson and Julian Lewis, and then you're looking at Isaac Wilson transferring in from Utah. Who's, I guess everyone's just not comfortable there.
Right. All right. Well, that's it, Jared. You put out great content. We're hoping we can add to it, in this early mock draft. Everybody come check us out at CFF List. Willie, I'll see you around. I know we'll keep putting out these transfer lists and all that stuff here in the next couple of weeks, so we'll be catching up soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Up next is a man who has been a staple in the CFF world for the last 10 plus years, and that is Mr. Mike Bainbridge. You can find him on Twitter at mbainbridgecff. You can also find his work over at the CFF site, as well as appearances on the CFF All Access show. For his team, Mike drafted wide receiver Easton Messer out of Florida Atlantic, followed that up with 3 running backs in Darius Taylor of Minnesota, Mekhi Hughes of Houston, and Jamari McClure out of Tulane. He then grabbed 2 wide receivers in Braylon Staley of Tennessee and Trey Richardson of Louisville. He then grabbed his 2 quarterbacks, Avery Johnson of Kansas State and Caden Veltkamp of Florida Atlantic, and then finished up with a tight end pick in Juice Vereen, who is now at Colorado State. All right, Mike, have at it.
What's up, everybody? Mike Bainbridge here from the CFF site. Here for the way too early mock draft hosted by the great Jared Palmgren over at Chasing the Natty. Always very happy to be here, and thanks again for the invite. I had the 10th pick out of 12 in the first round here. So with that, I can jump into some of the questions here. Your general observation of this year's player pool and anything unique to previous years. These seasons are all blending together at this point for me, but I think it's the same as last year. My answer is going to sound very similar here. The QB position at this point in the offseason looks particularly strong. Scanning over some of the G5 options this year in particular, and you're getting returning starters that have proven production. You need to look at Texas State's Brad Jackson, Delaware's Nick Minicucci, some of the dual threats that are returning here. Caden Creel is returning. He was an outstanding runner there over at Jacksonville State. Brock Lowry was awesome for Western Michigan. Lunge Winfield. There's a handful of other guys too. Roman Gagliano over at Middle Tennessee. So there's a lot of options there at the G5 level. And I think that was boosted by some of the transfers too. You're getting Jackson Arnold coming over to UNLV, which obviously produced Anthony Calandra. He had an outstanding season last year. So I think Jackson Arnold can potentially duplicate that. Haas Haney coming over from TCU and Oklahoma State. transfer. Very interesting landing spot there at Colorado State. So just a ton of options at the G5 level, in particular with quarterback. Wide receiver tends to look shallow this time of the year, but I think that's pretty consistent with depth charts needing to be sorted out. I think a perfect example of that is LSU. They added about 20 transfers, it seems like, this offseason. I think you're seeing that over a lot of schools in the P4 in particular, just because of, the transfer portal and how much NIL dollars that they're accumulating there at P4 schools, that they can bring in a ton of depth, which somebody like, Lane Kiffin and LSU did at wide receiver. So, good players, but we need those wide receiver rooms to take shape, and that's why maybe it looks a little bit more shallow, than it does, later in the offseason. What's your favorite pick? And then what's your least favorite pick? I'm going with the same FAU stack that I had in last year's way too early mock draft. I got Easton Messer in the first round, and Caden Veldkamp there later on in the draft. And, it wasn't a great year for FAU. Obviously, on the field, they were 4-8 overall record. But offensively, we saw a lot of the characteristics that we expected to see. FAU was number 1 in the country in pass attempts per game, and they were second behind only Maryland in pass play rate. So, we obviously saw the Zach Kitley style offense that we expected to see. And, Caden Veldkamp wasn't perfect, obviously, but, finishing QB 28 was a pretty good start for him in his first year, with Zach Kitley together at FAU. And then, Easton Messer was obviously the target hog that most expected. He didn't finish any higher than he did because of the touchdown equity, but we saw late in the year he had 5 touchdowns in the last 4 games. So, the upward trajectory for Easton Messer looks particularly strong. I think he's worth a first-round pick, again, particularly if you play in a PPR format. I didn't have a least favorite pick, but I think my most debated selection was Trey Richardson, the Vanderbilt transfer coming over to Louisville. The wide receiver 1 for Jeff Brom is obviously well established in the CFF community at this point. And, Richardson played 71% of his snaps outside last year at Vanderbilt, despite being 5'10". And we obviously are looking outside primarily in this Jeff Brom scheme. 9 out of the last 10 years, that wide receiver 1 has been an outside receiver. So I think Richardson's the favorite. But, as I alluded to earlier, these depth charts are needing to be sorted out. And, Louisville got back Trayshawn Hurry, who was with the team last year when he transferred previously from San Jose State. They also added LaWayne McCoy from Florida State. While he didn't have a ton of production, he had a 100-yard game in that season finale against Florida. So there's potential that he could factor into that equation as well. So Trey Richardson is the favorite, I think, in most people's minds, just because of his production last year with Vanderbilt. But, I could see that wide receiver room going in a couple different directions next year. What's something I do differently next time? I think I liked the strategy that I had. I hit Messer in the first round, and then I knocked out 3 running backs in the next 3 rounds. But I can see how it'd be advantageous to take wide receiver earlier in the drafts. I've alluded to it a couple times now. The depth charts are in flux at this point in the offseason, so it makes sense, I think, to lock down a Malachi Toney, an Easton Messer, right? Jeremiah Smith in the first couple rounds, because there will be more variance at that wide receiver position. You look at some of the mid-round picks, Richardson, Cam Coleman, Jace Brown, Chase Hendricks now at Cal. These are all really good players, but those pecking orders at those schools are just, far from established. So I can understand getting a more proven commodity in the first couple rounds at that position. Players that I was surprised went undrafted. I think Northwestern running back Caleb Kolamafe sticks out. 941 yards and 11 touchdowns last year as a first-year starter. And I get some hesitation. I'm guessing it's depth why he didn't get selected. They bring back Joseph Hyman. Gavin Sawchuk now comes over from Florida State. They brought in a Bowling Green transfer as well. So they do have some capable depth, but I don't know. Northwestern's going to run the football. They always do. And I think that's even more going to be the case now with Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator. So that was somebody I think is worthy of a top 9 round selection. The other one is Jaheim White. I was curious where he was going to go with this. You get the P4 transfer going down to a G5 school, and we all know that Jaheim White has talent. And I think it suits well with, Neil Brown coming over as well as the new North Texas head coach. It's obviously White's played in that scheme for multiple years back at West Virginia. He averaged like 7 yards a carry in those couple years too. So I was surprised that he wasn't drafted in the first 9 rounds. I think his ADP arc is going to be one to follow over the course of the offseason. Which players do I expect to rise or fall in drafts as the year goes on? I think one faller, and I got to give Chris K a pass here because I think right after he selected Mark Fletcher in the 4th round, it was later that day maybe, it was announced that Jordan Lyle and Gerard Pringle would be back for Miami. So they're getting all of their top 4 rushers back. And, I just don't foresee Miami utilizing Fletcher how they did in the college football playoff during the regular season next year with all that capable depth coming back. And I think that's a trend, honestly, with some of these playoff schools. You think of the Ohio States, the Texases, the Notre Dames of the world, Oregon. With Ohio State in particular, you didn't see Bo Jackson really get 15 to 20 carries a game until late in the month of November and then into the college football playoff. I just think these teams have so much ample depth at the position that you're not going to get the consistent workload that you want from a player like a Mark Fletcher. Riser, I did take Jamari McClure from Tulane in the 4th round. I could see him getting drafted a couple rounds higher, potentially, maybe not a 1st round pick, but a 2nd or 3rd round pick later in the offseason. He closed the year really strong too, had 100 yards in the conference championship game against North Texas. And then going into the college football playoff, obviously they got blown out by Ole Miss, but 84 yards on 15 carries. You like to see that from a G5 running back, particularly against an opponent like Ole Miss on a stage like the college football playoffs. So, he's got familiarity with new head coach Will Hall, who was on Tulane's staff last year. And, looking back a couple years ago when Will Hall was the head coach at Southern Miss, he obviously he had Frank Gore Jr. as his top running back, who had a couple of top 30 fantasy seasons for a running back. So I like the fit for McClure. I think he's got top 10 upside at running back. And to close it out, any draft strategy that I think is best for this year, any specific strategies with schedule maybe or anything of that note, we'll probably talk about later in the offseason. But I think early on, just take the same approach as maybe last year, hit the skill positions early, running back, wide receiver, doesn't really matter. I think you hit those in the first 5 rounds. And then you can punt quarterback to a certain degree. I wouldn't wait till the end of the drafts, but maybe beyond round 5, you start hitting your quarterbacks. If you look back to last year, 8 of the top 10 scorers at the quarterback position had ADPs beyond round 10. So you definitely do not have to hit that position early on. So to close it out, thanks again to Jared for hosting this annual event. I can't wait to start drafting for real once we get into once Fantrax opens up in the month of this month, hopefully. And as always, go blue.
Thank you very much, Mike. Up next is the duo over at the G5 Hive, Luke Probasco and Justice. You can find them on Twitter at G5 Hive, as well as their newly launched website, g5hive.com. For their team, they picked Wyatt Young, the wide receiver at Oklahoma State, LJ Martin, the running back out of BYU, Chris Don, the wide receiver out of Texas State, Ja'Kurian Turner, running back out of Pittsburgh, Kendrick Raphael, the running back now at SMU, quarterback Liam Sarka, the out of Air Force there, wide receiver Ryan Williams, quarterback Josh Hoover out of TCU, and finally they finished up with tight end Kalen Chunzinski. the tight end out of Boston College. I do want to note here that during their segment, Luke does refer to an awesome chart that they have over on their website, but unfortunately, due to the constraints of the formatting for the special, I was unable to show it on screen. So once again, I do want to say, make sure you go check it out yourself by going over to their website, g5hive.com. Regardless of that, they bring a ton of great analysis, so let's hear what they have to say.
I'm Justice.
And I'm Luke.
And we are the G5 Hive.
The G5 Hive is a college football podcast dedicated to the G5 Group of 6 beginning in 2026 conferences.
You can find the show on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts.
We can be found on X at G5 Hive and on Instagram at _G5_Hive.
And we recently launched a website for those that play college fantasy football or campus to Canton leagues, G5hive.com.
And in this way too early mock draft, we have the 11th pick. So we've got 1.11, 2.2, etc. from there. So Justice, let me kick off the questions to you. What is your general opinion of this year's draft pool and anything unique compared to previous years?
I don't really think anything super unique. I feel like it's been this way for the most part, at least last year anyway. But I feel like quarterback is super deep, maybe even deeper than last year. I feel like running back is pretty deep. And then wide receivers, kind of like the big unknown. It feels like there's 4, I guess, safe picks in terms of wide receivers, and Malachi Toney, Jeremiah Smith, Easton Messer, and maybe Bo Sparks. And then after that, like, you're kind of, who are you comfortable with? And so, so many of those wide receiver studs have moved on to the NFL, graduated or gone to new schools. And also tight end, I would say, is fairly deep as well. There's no like stud tight end, but there's a lot of like good options. And I think, you and I both talked, and that's kind of how we feel about this draft overall. Very similar to what I feel like last year.
So I think it's a little bit different than last year, where last year I felt like running back wasn't as deep, at least at the beginning, and I felt better with some of those wide receiver names. And then it seemed like there was like a couple tight ends that you could really pinpoint of like, hey, this guy might be a dude, where this year it's more unknown. It's deeper, but you don't have those upper echelon types of guys, even though we know somebody's going to emerge, especially in the wide receiver. Somebody's going to emerge. Who is that? We don't know yet.
Well, speaking of our picks, who was your favorite pick on our team, and who was your least favorite?
So I guess we'll kind of go into the least favorite first, and it was our first pick in Wyatt Young. Why? Because of those guys like you mentioned. You had Malachi Toney, Jeremiah Smith, Bo Sparks, Easton Messer all go before us, and then I felt like with our pick of Wyatt Young in the 111 spot, that's your first, like, we'll see how this goes. It is a same system, coaching staff. You're just making that switch to Oklahoma State. So it should work out. But you got Easton Messer, who comes back to the same system, same quarterback, Bo Sparks, Jeremiah Smith, Malachi Toney. You have all those knowns. This is your first kind of unknown, and it's kind of the best educated unknown pick, and it doesn't feel great as your first pick of the draft. Now, my favorite pick is in the 3rd round. We took Chris Don at 311, and you're getting, again, Brad Jackson coming back to Texas State, same offensive system. He's going to get you about 1,000 yards, and we got that out of our second wide receiver in our 3rd pick. I'm like, oh, that feels great. Now, he's not the number 1 option, but that pick felt so much better and more secure than our 101, where it's like, that should work and whatnot. What about you?
Yeah, so my favorite pick was our first quarterback, Liam Sarka. Sarka was a man on a mission once he took over that job there at Air Force. Unfortunately, got hurt, or else I think he would have been a league winner for many teams a year ago. But yeah, an elite running quarterback. He was putting up massive points each and every week once he secured that job. And then for me, probably the least favorite. It's not like a least favorite, like I hate the guy or anything, but just like we had a lot of debate about what to do with this pick, probably the most debate we had, and that was wide receiver Ryan Williams.
So we talked about the G55.com. Pull it up, Justice. So this is kind of what we were looking at because we were kind of thinking about, hey, who do we go with? Do we go with Ryan Williams here, or do we? Who was the other guy we
were talking about? Now this is probably when we ended up taking Williams was late in the draft, but we had this conversation was earlier when all the Indiana receivers are still on the board too, and we were debating between Indiana receivers and Alabama receivers,
or Lotsair Brooks. Like, who do we want, the slot, or do we want the out wide? So as you can see here, we're using our G55.com website, and we're looking at Kalen DeBoer's offense, and we're looking at the Kurt Sinetti offense, and we're looking at those wide receiver ones and twos, and you can see for Alabama, the wide receiver one outside, wide receiver one outside, wide receiver one slot, wide receiver one slot. Okay, we're hit or miss. It's 50-50. You can see those splits. Wide receiver one getting about 100 targets or so, and then Indiana, you got wide receiver one slot, wide receiver one outside, wide receiver one outside, like wide receiver one slot, and you can see what those splits are, and they're a little bit tighter, but you're right around 90. It's like, okay, is in a PPR league, is what do you want? So then we switched and we're like, okay, well, I know touchdowns aren't sticky, but we can look at what those coaches are doing in the red zone, and we can see Alabama, or I guess Kalen DeBoer versus Sinetti, they both prefer the slot wide receiver compared to the outside wide receiver when it comes to touchdowns. And then that's one of the reasons, like, Ryan Williams was 40% in the slot, 60% on the outside. As long as he can catch the ball, I mean, that's been like, his big problem lately. But if he can catch the ball, he kind of gives you the best of both worlds. And then, hey, here's Ryan Williams.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, I didn't hate the pick from, but it was probably the one we had the most debate about, and definitely my least favorite of our draft.
All right. So, Justice, what's something you would do differently next time, other than not picking Ryan Williams or whoever?
If this was a full mock where we're drafting a full roster, probably really the only thing I would do differently in a real draft is just wait even longer on quarterbacks, because there are just so many great quarterbacks available in the draft. I think you and I talked about that, but I think we both kind of felt the same way. We were happy with our draft overall, but given the constraints, you had to draft certain positions, and we had to draft them much earlier than we probably would in an actual draft where you draft in a full roster.
I don't have much to add there. You pretty much.
All right. Which players were you surprised that went undrafted through 9 rounds?
I mean, you labeled some here that I'll just read, but it's a lot of those quarterbacks. Cale Helms, Micah Alhado. There's running backs like Evan Dickens, Jaheim White, Dylan Riley that are still available. There was a lot of running backs that went off, and none of those guys were there. And then, kind of depends on what you need. Cale Helms, do you want that option quarterback, the guy that's going to run it on the ground? Do you want a floor guy? Mike Alhado, I know we talked about taking kind of our ceiling because we had Liam Sarka. It's like, okay, do we get kind of a ceiling guy with Mike Alhado? Kind of hit injuries of kind of like, I don't know if I want to take him yet, and there's other options out there. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, quarterbacks and running back, just so deep. So many of those still available. I agree with that.
So which players do you expect to rise or fall in drafts as the year goes on?
For me, probably the biggest one is going to be what happens with Trinidad Chambliss. Does his waiver get approved? Does he come back? And if he does, obviously, like we weren't allowed to consider him in this draft. He's someone I think we would have drafted or others people might have drafted as well. And then like Deuce Knight, so it's just kind of the unknown in that quarterback situation. Who's it going to be, Deuce Knight, or is it going to be Trinidad Chambliss? I can see that's once that decision is made in terms of Chambliss's eligibility. I can see those guys moving up draft boards fairly quickly, probably.
For me, I just think I don't want to pinpoint a particular person, but I think the running backs. We had 15 running backs go in the first 2 rounds. I think it could be more because, like I mentioned at the beginning, and you mentioned, you got Tony Smith, Sparks Messer. Like, does somebody take Wyatt Young? We had a quarterback go in the second round. Does a quarterback go, or do they go later? Did you have Isaiah Sategna in there? Like, and Parker Kingston, do they go? I think we're going to see more running backs get put there because people are going to feel like they're not, I don't want to say burning a pick, but they're not. They just feel more comfortable taking running backs there. Then I think at that point, then you see wide receivers fall a little bit. One of my favorite picks, I know we're not necessarily getting to the favorite picks, is Austin Dendy. Volume picks took him that 308. I don't know if he goes that high, but I feel like that's probably about the right range. Third, fourth round, he's going to be a guy I think that could rise up draft boards, especially if more running backs come off the board. Wayman Jordan, Chris K took him in the third round. I mean, he was great when he was healthy there at USC, putting up points. So, yeah. In general, I guess, Justice, what draft strategy do you think is best for this year?
I would say definitely get your guys at wide receiver, right? Because after, like we talked about, those first four guys, I feel like after that, like, you need to go get the guys you want, because I think that's what people are going to do, because there's so much more unknown after those first four guys that if you really like a receiver, you need to go grab them, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of rhyme or reason in terms of when, like, the next group of receivers go or who that next group is. So if there are receivers you really like, I would be aggressive and go get them.
And I would say I really like the start of a wide receiver, running back, wide receiver. I think if you were to ask all these guys, which you will, of like, hey, how do you start this? I think I like our roster, and I look at everybody else's roster who started that way, like CFS list, Bo Sparks, Justice Haynes, Deuce Robinson, Jaden Thomas, Nick Minicucci, Brendan Sword. Like, I think those rosters just right now, today and the end of January, feel a lot better than some of these wide receivers you might be, hoping for.
Well, that's going to do it for us. Thanks again, Jared, for the invite. And if you're looking for more from us, tune in every Monday night, 10:30 Eastern on YouTube and X.
And hey, we got our Worker Bee series coming up. You want to get all the skinny on all the G5, G6 teams and who's rising up the depth charts? Tune in to us.
Thank you, gentlemen. To finish off, we have the CFF team lead over at Fantasy Points, Mr. Josh Chevalier. You can find Josh on Twitter at CFF Guys and on the CFF All Access Pod. For his team, Josh Chevalier picked running back Kewan Lacey out of Ole Miss, quarterback Brad Jackson out of Texas State, running back Nate Shepard out of Duke, quarterback Arch Manning out of Texas, Terrence Carter, the tight end out of Texas State, then three wide receivers in a row here with Sean Wilson of Delaware, Latsier Brooks out of Alabama, and Cooper Barcate now at Miami of Florida. And then he finished off with another running back pick in Adam Muhammad out of Cal. All right, Josh, last one in. Let's go out with a bang.
Hey, Jared, thanks for letting me participate in the Way Too Early Mock Draft 2026. It's always fun to get back into college fantasy football, and it's certainly never too early. For those that don't know me, my name is Josh Chevalier. I am over at Fantasy Points. My X handle is at CFF Guys, and I had the 12th pick in this Way Too Early Mock Draft. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of my draft and then my strategy as well. I picked up I was at the turn, right, with the 12th pick. So in my first two picks, I picked up Kewan Lacey, running back out of Ole Miss, and then Brad Jackson, QB out of Texas State. Came back and did running back QB again in third, fourth round with Nate Shepard, running back out of Duke, and then Arch Manning as the first pick of the fourth round, QB out of Texas. And then in fifth and sixth round, I went Terrence Carter, tight end out of Texas Tech. I got the first tight end off the board. And then I came back with Sean Wilson, wide receiver out of Delaware. And then double tapped wide receiver in the round 7 and 8 with Latsier Brooks, wide receiver out of Alabama, and Cooper Barcate, wide receiver out of Duke. and then finished off this draft with Adam Muhammad at running back, who is the new RB1 at California. My strategy in this draft is really to, look, it's pretty obvious, just take returning production in places that they're familiar with for the most part. So my first 7 picks, that's pretty much what I did. I picked guys that are returning into the same spot, really in the same role that they had in the previous year. Obviously, Latsier Brooks is going to be stepping into that slot role for Jeremy Bernard. And then Cooper Barkate, that's the first place I didn't take a guy that was returning to the same school, but he is returning with the same quarterback as he transferred to Miami with his roommate and former Duke quarterback Darian Mensah. And then Adam Muhammad, he transfers over to California, so obviously he's in a new spot, but he is really taking over for Kendrick Raphael, who's, I think, vacates like 231 carries. And I'm hoping that they really try to feed Adam Muhammad, because he's a guy that Washington definitely wanted back. And so they must have promised him some type of workload there at California, and an offense that should be pretty dynamic heading into 2026. A couple questions here that Jared wants us to answer. First one is, what is your general opinion of this year's player pool? Anything unique compared to previous years? Look, I think we're really starting to settle into the transfer portal era. We know what that looks like. NIL has spread out talent. It's made the player pool bigger overall. I think QB and running backs, those positions are really deeper because of the transfer portal, while positions like wide receiver and tight end, at least this year, I think they're just a bit more shallow or unpredictable, right? As we get into the season, we'll know who the wide receiver ones are, the positions to target, or the players to target. But for now, there's a lot of uncertainty, as there's a lot of transition, and there's more variance at the wide receiver position than there, quite frankly, is at QB or running back. Same thing with tight end. A lot of unknowns this year with Sadiq, Stowers, and Koziel all going to the NFL. Those guys were really big in fantasy football over the last year or even two for Stowers and Koziel. So a lot of new fresh blood at the tight end position, which should make for some interesting drafts. I did draft Terrence Carter as the second tight end off the board in the 5th round, because he's one of the rare returning talents at the position. And I had other guys that I liked, like DJ Vaname, but I wanted to see where those guys fell in this draft and see where they would go. So I picked Carter early, but I'll certainly probably wait on the tight end position in the future as guys like DJ Vaname that I like. If they're around in the 9th round or so, then I'll probably go for them. And there's a lot of good tight ends that were picked in the 9th round of this draft. Second question is, who was my favorite pick on my team? My favorite pick for me was Arch Manning. It's a guy that averaged 30 fantasy points per game over his last 6 and just looked great. He looked like he really settled into the QB position after struggling early on. Of course, he had a bump in the road against Georgia, but most quarterbacks do, as they have a tough defense. And he looks really primed to take over and to take that next step in his progression, with guys like Cam Coleman coming in, Ryan Wingo and Emmett Mosley returning, and even Rayleigh Brown and Dalen Smothers, or Hollywood Smothers, that can both catch passes out of the backfield. I think this all sets up for Arch Manning and this Texas offense to really take that next step this year, and for him to be the beneficiary of that next step. My least favorite pick, but probably the pick that I should have picked the most, was Sean Wilson, wide receiver out of Delaware. He's coming back. He has 100 returning targets. He's returning his QB. But he averaged like 13 to 14 fantasy points per game last year. And so it's not a sexy pick by any stretch of the imagination. And those, I usually want to make a splash in drafts like these. But I've really decided I want to be disciplined here and really try to take guys that we're going to know what type of production they have returning. And so I went Sean Wilson as my wide receiver 1. So I don't like it, but I think it was actually a pretty smart pick in that place. What's something that I would do differently next time? I already mentioned that I'll wait on tight ends. That's what I would do. see if I can get somebody later, like Vaname, who John Laub picked in the 9th round. I think the second pick of the 9th round. Look, shout out John Laub in general. That dude had a phenomenal draft. I really love what he did, particularly at the QB position, getting Sam Levitt in the 5th round, and then Darren Mensah in the 8th round. Mensah will, I think, particularly be good in 6-point passing touchdown leagues. And then you have wide receivers where he got Jeremiah Smith in the 1st round, and then Charlie Becker in the 4th, and Ian Strong in the 6th. Look, I think both Becker and Strong are going to be in position battles for that wide receiver 1 role. I think Becker and Strong are both going to win those battles. And so for me, these are guys that I was looking at and hoping they would fall a little bit further in this draft. But, man, Laub is smart. He knows what he's doing, and so he took those guys before I could. And so shout out Laub. Really love what you did, man. I think you set up a good blueprint for the rest of us to look at for the rest of this offseason as we get into best balls and then into our redrafts. Again, Jared, thank you so much for having me in this draft. And again, I think what I'm going to be doing in drafts early on is I'm looking for proven production, guys that are returning in the same place, particularly at the wide receiver position. And then I'm going to take shots later on. And that's exactly what I did in this draft. And I'll continue to do that this offseason. Even my rankings, I'm going to be more conservative in the way that I rank, especially early on in my rankings to reflect guys that we should be taking early on in our drafts. And then, that's what we do all offseason. We analyze and we figure out who are some of these guys like Danny Scudero that we're not on right now, but we will be on in 2 or 3 months as we figure out that he, as we figured out he was going to be the clear wide receiver 1 there at San Jose State. We'll be figuring all that out this offseason, but let's not push him up too early. Man, big question, I guess, for the rest of us is where's Matthew Coleman going to go this year? Was not surprised that he wasn't drafted, but I am curious to see, will he be the wide receiver 1 at San Jose State? Those are things for us to figure out throughout this offseason, but thanks again, Jared, for having me. Look forward to drafting together this offseason with you and all of those that are listening here. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you once again, Josh. Alrighty, y'all. That's our special. Once again, I really want to thank each and every CFF expert who not only participated in this mock, but also took the time afterwards to bring their analysis to this special in order to provide the best experience for our viewers. The Twitter handles of every member in this draft will be found below, so please, please, please make sure you go and follow each and every one of them. Finally, I really want to thank each and every one of you guys out there for listening who have watched to this point. You guys are the reason we can keep doing stuff like this, and the growth you guys have helped create is the reason why we'll be able to keep doing this kind of stuff in the future. For now, that wraps up this special for the experts, for myself, for everyone involved. I really hope you guys have a blessed day, and I'll see you guys next time on Chasing the Natty.